The law of the Old Covenant that is, probably summarized and most vividly seen in the Ten Commandments is very interesting because even though it is part of God's revelation to us, a great deal of it is actually a part of the natural law. For example, in the Ten Commandments, 9 out of the 10 commandments are a part of the natural law. They are things that through through the use of our own reason and understanding our own humanity properly, we could have sort of come up with on our own. It makes it a little easier when God just goes ahead and tells us. The only one, just as a fun fact to know and tell, the only one of the 10 commandments that's not part of the natural law is actually the third commandment, to keep holy the Sabbath day. That is a part of Revelation. God had to reveal that to us. And so it's interesting, though, that the law, although the law was a great gift to God's people, to his chosen people, to the Jewish people, because it gave them this, wonder. It's like, maybe driving down a highway. I know my parents lived for a while when they were first married in Brazil, and they said in a lot of the cities there at that time, in any case, they'd have these big, beautiful, broad highways that didn't have any lines on them. And there's all this traffic just going every which way. And it was kind of exciting, but maybe a little dangerous at times, And that's what human life can be like without the law. Maybe kind of exciting, but a little dangerous. And so that's what the law that God gave to his people was. We're like, painting the lines on the road and putting up the stop signs and the, and the speed limit signs and things like that. That helped us to navigate life a lot better. And when Jesus came, he said that, I have come to fulfill the law. And some of his beautiful teaching that we've looked at before, like, for example, in the Beatitudes and in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus explicitly says this. He says, Moses told you this, and I say this to you. And it's usually he ups the ante in a way. He makes it... He says that the law of God has to be not only observed in our external actions, but really written on our heart and coming from the inside. And so Jesus did not, do away with the law. Some people, though, have really struggled with the law. St. Paul had to struggle with a lot of people in the early days of Christianity who were convinced that in order to be a Christian, frankly, in order to be saved, that you had to follow the law, the Torah. And St. Paul was very emphatic about this, that no, the law does not save us, and it doesn't, any more than lines on a road save us. They don't. As a matter of fact, about all they can do for you is like show you when you've broken the law. And by having the law, about all we can know for sure sometimes is when we have broken it. The law does not help us to keep the law. The law, and sometimes makes us aware even more of our guilt, actually. And so we are certainly not saved by observance of the law. As a matter of fact, we can't observe the law. We don't observe the law perfectly. We're incapable because of original sin and our own actual sin to do that. And so then, although the law serves a very useful purpose for us, how are we saved? How is this condition of the sinfulness of the world that we talked about a little earlier, the injustice and the inequality, how is that addressed? How is the burden of sin lifted from us? And that is through the saving mystery of Jesus Christ. That is how we are saved. Through his coming, becoming a man and living among us, through his suffering, through his death, his resurrection, and his glorious ascension, through his sending of his Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost to be with us and to lead us into all truth. This is the way of salvation and our participation in his life that he shares with us through grace. And that's where we need to look. Again, this is another word I think it's really important for us to stop and talk about and think about a little bit. It's this word grace. It's one of those words that we use a lot of times. We hear a lot in church, but really, what is grace? Grace is everything God grants us without our deserving it in the least. There's a beautiful quotation from St. Augustine in one of the columns. It's on page 187. God never gives less than himself. Grace literally comes from a Latin word that means gift. And what is God giving us? Well, we could go into a pretty fancy theological definition, but really I think St. Augustine cut right to the heart of it. Grace is a gift that God makes to us of himself, of his life. And his life, as we've talked about earlier, is very different from our life. Even human life in its full perfection is always limited, whereas God's life is full and perfect in every way. So, of course, first of all, through his grace, he heals us. He restores the dignity that we lost through sin, through the sin of Adam and Eve, and through our own sin. And he gives and shares the fullness of his life with us. There's a nice paragraph in the Youcat. It's question 339. What does God's grace do to us? And it has a very nice theological treatment of different sorts of grace, different sorts of gifts that God shares with us. The most fundamental kind of grace is, and most necessary, is what we call sanctifying grace. The grace that we receive through baptism that makes us children of God and heirs of the kingdom of heaven. That's the most important thing that can ever happen to us. It's to be claimed by the Heavenly Father, to be his child and to be an heir of the kingdom of heaven. That means that we can live with him forever in the fullness of life, in a kind of life that we really only have hints of. It is an amazing thing, that gift of baptism. There's also what we call habitual grace, that ability that we have over time to choose to do good more and more easily, more and more effortlessly, more and more almost in a natural way. But it comes about through the work of grace in us. There are what we call also actual graces. You know, have you ever had that situation where you're in the middle of maybe of a temptation or a need to make a decision, or a situation where there is some pull to do some good deed, and all of a sudden you were just able to do it? Well, that is an actual grace. God sends those to us as well. Of course, each of the sacraments has its own particular grace attached with it, this way that God gives his life in a particular way through the sacraments. And so grace comes before everything in our spiritual life. God always takes the first step. God always provides the grace that we need. And yet, in a very mysterious way, we also remain free. It would sound like if we had grace, then we have to choose the good. It doesn't make us choose the good, but it allows us to be able to. It allows us to live this fullness of life. And so grace actually does not compete with freedom. Grace is what allows us to be free to choose the good. So essentially, we are saved by grace, the grace that Jesus Christ won for us through his suffering, death, and resurrection. We are justified, that our relationship with God is healed, and we are made literally righteous. We are in a right relationship with God again. And so that's very important for us to remember, especially when we're talking about how we're supposed to live our faith, the demands of the church's social teaching, is to remember, though, that we are not saved by our good deeds, but by the grace of Jesus Christ. But our good deeds are necessary as we cooperate with God's grace. And so that's how we exercise our freedom. God gave us our freedom not just to be able to do any old thing. That wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. God gave us our freedom so that we could do the good. So freedom is directed to the good. So you see how grace, in that sense, then, allows us to be more and more free. The more that we choose to do the good, the freer we are to choose it the next time. And conversely, the more that we are slaves when we deliberately choose not to do the good. It's harder and harder for us to do the good after that. And so we are saved by God's grace to us, won for us by Jesus Christ. So we don't get to heaven by our good works, but we don't get to heaven without our good works either, if that can make any sense for you. At the end of the day, we are called upon to be saints. That's what God made you to be a saint. As one of the saints said, all of us, our first name all begins with S, saint. But you're not going to be Saint somebody else. You're not going to be Saint, Bernadette or Saint Thomas Aquinas or Saint Maximilian Kolbe, great as they are. You're never going to be that saint. You're going to be Saint, fill in your name. You're going to have to be a living icon of Jesus where you are among the people you're with, just as all the saints were where they were and among the people that they were with. But that's what we are called to be. And to be a saint means to be holy. Those two words mean the same thing. They come from the same root, actually, in Latin. It means that we are really living in loving union with God. And that draws us into that loving union that really is the Holy Trinity itself. And that's what we are called to. Now, the community, we've been talking about living life in community. The community of the saints, the communion of the saints, is the church. Those of us who are striving for lives of holiness, who are responding to God's grace, growing in freedom, performing these beautiful good works in response to the grace that Jesus won for us in his suffering, death, and resurrection. We are drawn together into the communion of saints, into the church. And as we've talked about before, through this individual experience that we are all brought to be, justified by God, individually, we find ourselves, though, in this community of others who have been justified as well and who are also striving for holiness. And so we have the communion of saints, those who have gone before us, those of us here on earth who are still struggling away, to help one another. And we have their wisdom and their example, to help us as we go forward. And so the church is such a great guide to us. We don't have to make it up all on our own. We don't have to figure it out all on our own. We have this loving mother, our church, there, to guide us, and that communion of the saints. It can get down to, it's really interesting, it's another one of the things I've mentioned to you before I like about the Youcat. It really can get down to the really kind of the nitty-gritty. And there's one aspect of being a member of this community. They're sort of the basic minimal membership requirements, you might call them. They're called the precepts of the church, the 5 precepts of the church. And so I just want you to know them. They're in question 345. What are the 5 precepts of the church? Well, to go to Mass on Sunday and on the holy days of obligation, and to keep holy those days as well. To go to the sacrament of penance at least once a year. To receive Holy Communion at least during the Easter season. To observe the days of fasting, and also to contribute to the material support of the church as well. Those 5 precepts are the sort of the minimal requirements of the faith. Of course, we know that as Christians we're called to great heights that we've talked about before, and the heights that are shown to us in, for example, the corporal and the spiritual works of mercy, the Beatitudes, the entire Sermon on the Mount, those heights of holiness that really bring us into conformity with Christ. And finally, I want to just bring up one thing that sometimes people like to complain about being a member of the church, and that's the reality of hypocrisy. The Youcat acknowledges this, okay? It's defined on page 191. Hypocrisy implies a double standard in the morality that one practices publicly or implicitly. Externally, a hypocritical person advocates goals and values that he does not respect privately. Little children, let us not love in word or speech, but in deed and in truth. Or as one of the great saints said, love is shown not in sweet words, but in hard deeds. And it's really true. You know, there is hypocrisy in the church. There are people who do not live up to what they profess. As a matter of fact, I think, you know, sad to say, all of us probably, there's a little bit of hypocrite in all of us. If there isn't, then our ideals aren't high enough. Actually, if we're perfectly living our ideals, then they're not high enough. Not all of us are gonna fall short. But we need to you know, to strive to overcome in our lives whatever you know, whatever traces of this that we're aware of. Of course, hypocrisy is worse with people who are in, you know, official positions of the church, among, you know, priests or religious, and we must pray especially that they don't fall from the high ideals that they have set them to. But really, frankly, the fact that we have these high ideals is what is so important. This call that we have to live in this most perfect of all human communities, the church. When we're tempted to be, or maybe a little discouraged by the evidence of hypocrisy in the church, which sadly does exist, I just encourage you to remember a quotation from St. Joan of Arc, who certainly experienced a lot of the dark side of hypocrisy in the church in her own life. And yet she kept her faith in the church very strong and made this great profession when she said, "About Jesus and his church, I simply know that they're just one thing, and we shouldn't complicate the matter." Thank you very much.